Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. How are we today? I hope, as usual, the spirits are up and that this discussion on elasticity that we've been having over the last few sessions is really absorbing you and arresting your attention. Today will be our final lecture on elasticity. We will conclude our discussion on this very important topic. We will talk about the different types of elasticities that we did not talk about in the previous lectures. We will also discuss some real-world examples of how price elasticity, cross-price elasticity of demand, and income elasticity of demand apply in the real world. And we will conclude with the discussion of how elasticities feature in government's taxation policies and how the incidence of taxation varies when elasticities of demand and supply are different. However, before we start our discussion, let's do a little recap on what we learned in our previous lecture. Now, if you remember, we discussed a little bit of intuition about price elasticity of demand. We saw that when the price of a product, of a good increased, the quantity demanded did not rise proportionately, and this led to the total revenue increasing in the case of inelastic demand. So the direction of change of total revenue and prices was same in the case of inelastic demand, and the opposite was true for elastic demand, so that when prices increased, quantity demanded fell and total revenues also moved in the same direction. So total revenues also fell. Then in our last lecture, we saw that price elasticity of demand was used by firms in their decisions to set prices. And we gave the example of a bus company and when it was deciding what fare to charge to its travelers, passengers. We also saw that firms explicitly tried to change the price elasticity of products and tried to make the elasticity more inelastic, sort of less elastic, so that they could charge a higher price once the brand loyalty for their brand had been established. We also saw that the price elasticity of demand for foodstuffs was generally very low, ranging from between 0 and 1, which categorizes as inelastic. And we saw the implications that this had for exporters of foodstuffs, which many lower income countries, including Pakistan, although Pakistan exports cotton, but we are reliant on agricultural products as well. So many countries which export foodstuffs are subject to changes in the international price of foodstuffs, and those changes translate fully in changes or fluctuations in total revenue or the export proceeds in this case, and this has serious macroeconomic implications, and we will discuss this in greater detail as well. So now, let's start with a discussion of the two types of elasticities that we mentioned earlier on and defined earlier on, but didn't go into as much detail. The first one was the income elasticity of demand. And this basically measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded of a particular good to a change in the income of consumers. So could be individual consumer, could be households, could be the overall income level of the economy or the market for that good. As you can see, it is defined specifically as the percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in income. Let's look at our first slide and try to illustrate how the calculation of the income elasticity of demand is done both algebraically and graphically. Let's go to our first slide today. So the first thing to note is that quantity demanded will always respond positively to a change in income. This is a rule that we established for normal goods. However, we also saw that this response could be negative for inferior goods. But let's first of all see the case of a normal good. So we can draw the demand curve in YQ space as an upward sloping line. So the more vertical the demand curve is, the more inelastic it will be. The more horizontal or flatter the demand curve is, the more elastic it will be. So when it is more inelastic, a small change, a large change in income will only cause a small change in quantity demanded, whereas if it is elastic, that is, if it is less steep, then even a small change in income will cause a large change in quantity demanded. So this can also be represented in a PQ space. We'll have the traditional downward sloping demand curve. And remember that when you are drawing a demand curve in PQ space and studying the impact of changes in variables not shown on the vertical axis, so income would be that variable in this case, then you are talking about shifts in the demand curve. So if the product has a very high income elasticity of demand, then if income increases, it will cause a large shift in the demand curve, that is a large rightward shift in the demand curve. Whereas if the good has a very low income elasticity of demand, then even a large change in income will cause a very small shift, rightward shift in the demand curve. These two cases are shown clearly in the graph that you can see. Let's now look at a table and see how income elasticity of demand is calculated. Here we will take the case of point elasticity. So we will measure the income elasticity, which is denoted by YED, at a particular point. Now the table basically says that at an income level of 10,000 rupees, the quantity demanded of, let's say, some good A is 100 units. And if the income goes up to 12,000 rupees, then the quantity demanded of the good increases to 105 units. Now, recalling our formula for income elasticity of demand, which is basically the change in quantity demanded divided by the quantity, that is the starting level of the quantity demanded, whole divided by the change in income divided by the starting level of income. This will give us 5 over 100, where 5 comes from 105 minus 100. So it will be 5 over 100 whole divided by 2,000 over 10,000, where 2,000 is merely the change in income. This will deliver an income elasticity of demand of 0.25. Now there are two things to note about this value. The first is that the sign of the elasticity computed is positive. This is opposed to the negative sign that we obtained in the case of price elasticity of demand. Note, however, that in the case of price elasticity of supply, the sign was also positive. So the first thing here that we note is that the sign is positive, and this, if you recall, is an indication that the good is normal. Remember that we define normal goods as those goods on which expenditure of consumers would increase when the income of the consumer went up, whereas inferior goods were defined as goods on which expenditure would fall as the income of the consumer increased. So in this particular case, we see that the good is a normal good. Although the elasticity is very low in magnitude, it's only 0.25. Therefore, the income elasticity does not categorize in the elastic range. It will fall in the inelastic range. To formalize the second rule of elasticity, remember we talked about the first rule, which merely said that if elasticity is between 0 and 1, that would be inelastic, and if it were greater than 1, then it would be elastic. That was the first rule. The second rule can be formalized as follows. If the sign of income elasticity of demand is positive, then the good under consideration is a normal one, whereas if the sign is negative, then the good is, yes, inferior. Note in this example that the fact that you've got an elasticity of 0.25 does not mean that this is an inferior good. That is only the case when elasticity is negative. The fact that it is 0.25 and inelastic merely means that a smaller proportion of the increase in income is spent on the good. This is not the same thing as the expenditure on the good falling as a result of increase in income. What 0.25 is telling you is that for every 1% increase in income, 0.25% consumption goes up. So given that understanding of how the income elasticity of demand is computed and how we can interpret it, we can now talk about the determinants of income elasticity of demand. There are basically three determinants or three major determinants. The first one is the degree of necessity of the good. Now in a developed or advanced economy, the demand for luxury goods expands rapidly as people's incomes rise. Do you remember what luxury goods are? Yes, luxury goods are goods which are expensive and which are not necessities. So we constantly gave the example of Mercedes-Benz cars or Rolls-Royces or Cuban brand cigars. Those would all categorize as luxury goods. So the demand for luxury goods expands as people's incomes rise. That is in the case where people are already rich. Whereas the demand for basic goods such as bread will only rise a little when people's incomes rise, because people can't consume a lot of bread or different types of bread to the extent that it affects their overall consumption expenditure significantly. So items such as cars and foreign holidays have a very high income elasticity of demand, whereas items such as potatoes, jam, bread and bus journeys have a very low income elasticity of demand. As we mentioned in the second rule of elasticity, the demand for some goods actually decreases as income rises, and these are called inferior goods. An example of an inferior good would be, yes, cheap margarine, and we could compare it with butter, where butter was a good quality standard good. Now as people earn more, they switch to butter or better quality margarine. Inferior goods naturally then have a negative income elasticity of demand. This is just restating the second rule of elasticity. A second determinant of income elasticity of demand is the rate at which the desire for a good is satisfied as consumption increases. The more quickly people become satisfied, the less their demand will expand as income increases. I will give the example of food again. Now, as you consume more and more food, very soon your stomach will be full, and your desire to have more food will come to zero, because after a point you will simply not be able to consume more. Compare this with, let's say, the consumption of housing, right? So somebody has a small house, he can think about buying a bigger house, then he can think about buying two houses, think of buying houses in Murray, think of buying houses abroad. So the demand for housing is not as quickly satiated as the demand for food is. Therefore, the demand for housing, the income elasticity of demand for housing might be higher than the income elasticity of food. And this is because the rate at which the desire for food is satisfied as consumption increases is far greater than the rate at which the desire for, let's say, housing is satisfied as consumption increases. The third and final determinant of income elasticity of demand is the level of income of consumers. I would really call it the income distribution of the economy. If in the economy you have a case where the incomes of the rich are increasing and the incomes of the poor are falling, then you can well imagine what would happen to the demand for luxury goods. The demand for luxury goods would increase because rich people now have more money. Now consider what would happen if income was moved from the rich people in the economy to the poor people. That is, the income distribution became more equitable. In this case, the demand for goods that will increase will not be luxury goods, but will be standard normal goods, which poor people who have now become slightly richer would like to consume. On the other hand, you can note that inferior goods, the demand for inferior goods might fall rapidly or sharply, because the poor people who were relying on inferior goods due to their low income levels can now afford to dump those inferior goods in favor of better quality products. So both luxury goods and inferior goods might have very high elasticities of demand. I'm not talking about the sign of elasticity in this case, but merely whether they would be greater than 1 or less than 1. And my argument is that both luxury goods and inferior goods would have high income elasticity because their consumption will be affected greatly by the income distribution in the economy. Now, as we saw in the case of price elasticity of demand, let's look at what the income elasticities of demand are for various foodstuffs. Again, the figures are obtained from the Ministry of Agriculture estimates as presented in the Household Food Consumption and Expenditure Survey 1989 in the UK. Now, as you can see, many of the products, food products listed here have negative income elasticity of demand. That is, in an advanced country, these items characterize as inferior goods. Now, milk has an income elasticity of demand of minus 0.40. This might appear very surprising to us because in Pakistan, where poverty levels are high, milk is definitely not considered an inferior product. This also illustrates the point that income elasticities vary not only across consumers, but across countries. So entire countries might have different elasticity profiles from other countries, and the income distribution of a particular country becomes very important in that case. So milk, in the case of the UK, has an elasticity of minus 0.4. Eggs have an elasticity of minus 0.4. Mutton has an elasticity of minus 0.21, and similarly bread, butter, margarine, sugar, fresh potatoes, and tea, all of these have negative income elasticities of demand. That is, they are all inferior goods. The goods that categorize as normal goods here are cheese and beef and cakes and biscuits and fresh green vegetables, fresh fruit, fruit juices, and coffee. Now again, as you can see, cheese might not be considered a normal good in a country like Pakistan, where there might be greater preference for butter and milk per se. But in more advanced economies, or Western countries at least, there is a preference for different brands of cheese, which can sometimes become very expensive. Similarly, if you look at beef, it's considered a normal good in the UK, but in a country like Pakistan, people might prefer mutton or chicken to beef, and therefore you would expect a negative sign in front of beef to that extent. So overall, the result from this survey is that food generally is considered an inferior good. That is, as your income increases, your expenditure on food decreases. So overall, food characterizes as an inferior good, although the elasticity is very, very low. It is 0.01, minus 0.01, which means that a 1% increase in your income will cause just a minus 0.01% decrease in your expenditure on food. Now, what are the implications of this result that we've just seen? That the income elasticity of demand for foodstuffs is negative, that is, food is considered an inferior good, and that it is very inelastic, that is, the magnitude was only 0.01. We saw that the implications of price inelastic exports were that when prices in international markets went up and down, this caused fluctuations in export revenues. And we gave the example of lower income countries involved in the export of foodstuffs and and things like that, and how they got affected by these fluctuations in international markets, these fluctuations in prices. Now, similarly, in the case of income elasticity of demand, the implications for lower income countries' balance of payments are quite severe. What happens is that consider a world which is growing. So economic growth is happening, real income growth is positive. So what happens to an economy which is a lower income country? What happens to its demand for luxuries as its income increases? Now, as we've seen, the demand for luxuries or normal goods is usually positive, as the income elasticity of demand for these goods is positive. So as the income of this country, this poor country, increases, its demand for luxuries like cars and televisions and VCRs and computers to some extent will increase. So this means that they will demand more of the goods from abroad, especially if it is not producing these goods itself, which is usually the case for lower income countries. On the other hand, think of what is happening to the rest of the world. The rest of the world, once it gets richer, will reduce its demand for the basic foodstuffs that are being produced by that lower income country. So if the West is considered to be a major consumption bloc, then it will reduce its demand, or its demand will not be affected much by its increase in income. At least the demand for the foodstuffs being produced or the basic goods being produced by the lower income countries. Now this causes a serious asymmetry in the movement of the price of exports and the price of imports for this lower income country. On the one hand, its demand for imports from outside is increasing, whereas the demand for its own exports by foreign consumers is falling. Therefore, the ratio of the price of this country's exports to the price of this country's imports deteriorates. This ratio is called the terms of trade. And this is when we say that the terms of trade of lower income countries involved in the export of goods which either have low income elasticity or negative income elasticity is deteriorating over time. And the proof of this is that in the 1990s, lower income countries which were involved in the export of these basic foodstuffs only had 68% of the terms of trade that they had in 1960, whereas rich countries had 92% of the terms of trade that they had in the 1960s. So this is a major point of difference between lower income countries and rich countries, and it is often put forward as a reason, a structural reason, which is at the heart of the balance of payments problems of poor countries. So, given that brief discussion on income elasticity of demand, let's now stab into a discussion of cross-price elasticity of demand. That is the impact on the quantity demanded of one good in response to a change in the price of another good. That other good could be a substitute or could be a complement. So let's go to our series of slides illustrating the concept of cross-price elasticity of demand. Let's go to our slides. Now, if you recall, we defined cross-price elasticity as the percentage change in the quantity demanded of good A divided by the percentage change in the price of a related good B. So, if we look at an example in this table, we have figures for demand for a product A and the price of another product B. Now, the table says as follows. You have the demand for A at 100 when the price of B is equal to rupees 10, whereas the demand for A increases to 140 units when the price of B increases to 12. Now, plugging this in our formula, we get 40 over 100, where 40 is simply the difference of 140 and 100. So it's 40 over 100, which is the percentage increase in quantity demanded of A, and we divide it by the change, the percentage change in the price of B, which in this case would be 12 minus 10, that will give you 2 divided by 10. And this delivers a cross price elasticity of 2. Now what does this 2 mean here? The first thing that this says is that the sign of this elasticity is positive. And when should the sign be positive? Think about it. The price of one good is positively related to the demand for another good. Yes, this would be the case in which A and B are substitute goods, so that when the price of one increases, the demand for a substitute good A increases. So people who were initially consuming B shift their consumption and start consuming more of good A. So that's the first thing that this calculation is telling you. The second thing that it is telling you is that the demand, the cross price elasticity of demand falls in the elastic region. That is, it is greater than 1 and would categorize as elastic demand. And this is a measure of the closeness of substitutes. So in this case, we can conclude that the two goods are quite good substitutes for each other. That is, an increase in the price of B has a lot of impact in terms of the demand for the other good. If we got a figure, let's say, of 0.25, then we could have said that the demand, the cross price elasticity is low or falls in the inelastic region, and in that case we could have said that the two goods are not close or good substitutes. Now the calculation here enables us to state the third rule of elasticity, and that is that when the cross price elasticity is positive, goods are substitutes for each other, whereas when the cross price elasticity is negative, goods are complements of each other. An example of that would be, yes, petrol and cars. So that if the price of, let's say, petrol went up, the demand for cars would go down because the two go hand in hand. Cars use petrol, and if petrol becomes more expensive, the cost of running a car increases, and therefore the demand for cars will be negatively affected by the increase in the price of petrol. So that's broadly the intuition, the interpretation that we get from the computation shown here. Another example of the usefulness of the concept of cross-elasticity of demand is in the field of international trade and the balance of payments. A government will wish to know how a change in domestic prices will affect the demand for imports. If there is a high cross-elasticity of demand for imports, that is, in case imports and the goods produced locally are close substitutes, and if prices at home rise due to, let's say, inflation, that is, an increase in the price level prevailing in the economy, then the demand for imports will rise substantially and will thus worsen the balance of payments. So in that sense, the cross-elasticity, the cross-price elasticity of demand between imports and home-produced goods is very important for the overall balance of payments and could be another reason why lower-income countries suffer from balance of payments problems. So as you can see, lower-income countries usually produce goods which are easily substitutable by foreign goods. Whereas, let's say, if Japan, which produces high-tech cars or mobile phones or electronics, might find it difficult to substitute these goods from imports from abroad. So this is one possible reason why lower-income countries whose exports, whose local production has high substitutability with imports from abroad, can suffer from rising imports and a rising balance of payments deficit, as opposed to rich countries which produce goods which have no substitutes internationally. Now you might recall that in our discussion of price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply, we mentioned that both depended on the time period given to consumers and producers to respond. so that the longer the time period, the greater the elasticity was. Consumers, as their tastes and preferences could change over time, would respond to a particular price increase greater in the longer run than they could in the short run. Similarly, producers or firms could give a larger output response to a rise in price in the longer run, since some of the constraints of new plants or new firms entering are lifted, then they could respond in the short run. Now, after that discussion on income elasticity of demand and cross-price elasticity of demand, we are now in a position to see how this time dimension comes into play in our understanding of a macroeconomic event. And although we are not studying macroeconomics proper, we'll use our understanding of elasticities, especially price elasticity of demand and supply elasticity, price elasticity of supply, in order to show how long-run and short-run responses to demand and supply can be different. What we look at is the adjustment to the oil price shocks of 1973 and 1979. Now, there were two, I would say, major events in the 20th century, two major economic events. One was the Great Depression, and the other one was, in some people's opinion, the oil price shocks of the 1970s. What happened in the 1970s was that a group of petroleum exporting countries, that is producers of petrol, and this organization is called OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, you must have heard of it, decided to suddenly increase prices at a very high rate. And they raised prices from, I think, $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel in 1973. And then they had a second round of increase in 1979, where they raised it to close to $30 a barrel. Now, the impact of consumers and to other producers of petrol of this increase in price is very interesting to study, because it offers us good insights into how producers and consumers respond in the short run and how they respond in the long run. And this will then enable us to distinguish between short run and long run demand and price elasticities. So let's take a look at a graphical illustration of how producers and consumers responded to this particular event. Here is our slide. As you can see, we have drawn the demand and supply curves in PQ space, and here we are talking about short-run demand and supply curves. The initial equilibrium was at point A. Price of petrol was P1 dollars per barrel, and Q1 barrels were consumed by the world. Now, OPEC raised the price from P1 to P2, that is from $3 to $12 a barrel. At the same time, OPEC ensured that there would be no surplus at that price. That is, OPEC members restricted their output by agreed amounts. This was necessary, otherwise producers would have produced more at the higher price, and then that surplus would have pushed the price of petrol back to P1. So to ensure that there was no surplus and that the new price P2 was sustained, OPEC members restricted their outputs to generate an overall market supply of Q2. So this had the effect of shifting the supply curve to S2, with Q2 being produced. This reduction in output needed to be only relatively small, because the short-run demand for oil was highly price inelastic. Because for most uses of oil, there are no substitutes in the short term. However, let's now look at the long-run effects on demand. The long-run demand for oil was much more elastic. With high oil prices persisting, people tried to find ways of cutting back on consumption of oil. People bought smaller cars. People bought more efficient cars. In cold countries where there was a lot of need for heating, they converted to gas or solid fuel central heating systems. Firms on the other hand, switched to other fuels than petrol. Less use was made of oil-fired power stations for electricity. Attention was paid to nuclear and solar power sources. All these had an energy-saving effect. That is, the consumption of oil went down significantly in countries which were major consumers of oil. The effect of this was that the short-run demand curve shifted from D1 to D2. Price fell back from P2 to P3, and this gave a long-run demand curve of DL, where L stands for long run, the curve that simply joins A and C, the 2 points of equilibrium. Now, the fall in demand was made bigger by a world recession in the early 1980s. This is just a point of fact. Now, let's look at the long-run effects on supply. With oil production so much more profitable, there was an incentive, obvious incentive, for non-OPEC oil producers to produce oil. So, prospecting went on all over the world, and large oil fields were discovered and opened up in the North Sea, in Alaska, USA, in Mexico, China, and a lot of other places. In addition, OPEC members themselves were tempted to break their quotas, that is, their allotted output, and sell more oil at the higher price. The net effect of all this was an increase in world oil supplies. This is shown by a shift in the supply curve to S3. Equilibrium price thus fell back to P1, that is, point D. Note that the supply curves in these diagrams are all short-run supply curves, since each one shows supply for a particular number of oil fields. We could draw a long-run supply curve linking points E and F. The reasoning would be as follows. After the limiting of supply to S2, OPEC members would have supplied at point E, had the price remained at P1. After some years with the price set at P2 or thereabouts, more suppliers enter the market. The supply curve therefore shifts to S3 and moves the equilibrium to point F. This now is the intersection of S3 and the demand curve. Therefore, a long-run supply curve can be drawn by linking points E and F. The example that I just gave you is a very strong example of how short-run and long-run responses, both of suppliers and consumers, can be different in response to a price increase. Now, concluding our discussion on the time dimension of elasticities, we can now look at something we touched upon in one of our earlier lectures, and that is the imposition of taxation by government and the impact of that on demand and supply. Taxation policy is an important part of government policy, and believe it or not, it is very important for the government to know what are the elasticities of different products in order for the government to be able to design a good tax policy. Now, this again can only be illustrated by diagrams, so we'll have to refer to our slides for that. So let's proceed. First and foremost, look at this graph in PQ space, where a demand curve is drawn and a supply curve is drawn. Now, when a tax is imposed, it has the effect of shifting the supply curve upwards. If the tax is a specific tax, that is, the amount of tax is constant, is the same at all prices. So let's say you could say that the amount of tax per pack of cigarettes is 2 rupees. So whether the price of cigarettes goes to 40 rupees or 50 rupees, the tax will remain 2 rupees. In that case, you can simply represent the tax by shifting the supply curve up by 2 rupee units. So it will be a vertical displacement of the supply curve by 2 rupee units. On the other hand, if it's an ad valorem tax or a percentage tax, then you can well imagine that as the price increases, the size of the tax, that is the absolute value of the tax, will increase. So if the ad valorem tax is, let's say, 5% of the price of the cigarettes, then naturally as the price of cigarettes goes up, the amount of tax will increase. Therefore, the two supply curves here will now be shown as diverging as the price increases. But we will illustrate the point that we are trying to make about elasticities in the context of a specific or fixed amount of tax. That is, when the amount of tax per unit is fixed irrespective of the price. Now look at the diagram and see that the initial equilibrium before the tax obtained at point B. The initial revenues were OP0, BQ0, right? Now, after the imposition of tax, the new equilibrium is reached at point C. The total revenue in this case now is P1C Q1 naught. Now, of this, the government will take the tax revenues. Any guesses on how the government will calculate the tax revenues graphically in terms of the diagram? Think about it. Good. Yes. It will simply take the vertical distance, which is 2 rupees worth of tax, and multiply it by the new quantity, which is Q1. And this will be equal to the rectangle P1CAX. This is the total tax that the government collects. Now note that of this total tax, P0 P1CD is paid by the consumer, whereas P0 DAX is paid by the producer. This is called the incidence of taxation. In this particular case, the government and the producers are not so badly hit. As you can see, producer revenues or total revenues fall only very slightly from OP0 BQ0 to OXAQ1. But the consumer, he suffers in a major way because he pays a major part of the tax collected by the government. The government also is not too badly hit by the fall in the quantity of the good. As you know, as the price of something increases, its quantity demanded decreases. But because in this case, the demand curve is quite vertical, the decline in quantity from Q0 to Q1 is not very big. And therefore, the tariff revenues or the tax revenues can be earned on pretty much the same quantity that prevailed before the imposition of tax. The key thing to note here is the slope of the demand curve. The slope of the demand curve is very steep. Therefore, demand is characterized as inelastic, and therefore the consumer pays the brunt of the tax, and the government collects a lot of tax because the quantity demanded in equilibrium does not change very much. Now let's take the example of an elastic demand curve. That is, in case the demand curve is not very steep, it's downward sloping and pretty close to being horizontal. What is the implication of the tax now? The original tax revenue, as you know, was P0 B Q0 O. The new tax revenues in this case, denoted by TR1 prime, would be equal to P1 prime C prime Q1 prime O. Of this, the government will take P1 prime C prime A prime X prime, and of this, P1 prime C prime D prime P0 will be paid by consumers, whereas X prime P0 D prime A prime will be paid by producers. As you can now see, both government and the producers are much worse off in this case, and this has simply come about because of the increased elasticity of demand assumption used in this case. Now, the results about the incidence of taxation can be summarized by these 4 diagrams. In case 1, when demand is inelastic, it is easy to see that both producers and governments are happy with the tax on the supply of the good, right? And it is the consumers which will eventually pay most of the tax. In case 2, when there is elastic demand, the tax is a bad one because both producers and consumers suffer, plus the government also suffers because the quantity demanded falls in a major way from Q1 to Q2, so that the tax revenues that the government gets will be very small. Case 3 is the case of inelastic supply. In this case, it is the producer who suffers, whereas the government still gains and the consumer is still quite happy because most of the brunt is taken by the producer. Finally, you have the case of elastic supply, where both producers and consumers suffer, but the government also suffers, and this would again constitute as a bad tax. An example of case 1 would be a tax on cigarettes. Now, as you know, consumers' demand for cigarettes is usually very inelastic, and therefore the entire tax will be passed on to consumers. And this may be very desirable from the government's point of view, because one, it's getting very good revenues, tax revenues from the tax, and secondly, it's discouraging the habit of smoking. Similarly, in case 3, you could think of the government imposing a tax on firms which produce a certain good, and there's nothing wrong with the consumption of that good, but that in the production of that good, a lot of environmental pollution is created. Therefore, the government wants to discourage producers from producing a lot of that good, or at least it wants to earn revenues that it can then spend on cleaning the environment. So that could be an example of case 3. Now, the key thing to note about this discussion on taxation policy and elasticities is that a good tax for the government is one in which either demand is inelastic or supply is inelastic. Now, if the government wants the tax to fall on the consumers, then it should choose a product which has low price inelasticity of demand. Whereas if it wants to penalize producers, that is, if it wants the incidence of taxation to be on producers, then it should choose to impose tax on a good which has low price elasticity of supply. Another important point which our discussion tells us is that the relative bargaining position of these different groups, producers, consumers, and government, depends on the underlying elasticities of demand and supply. If the elasticity of supply is high, let's say, then if the government imposes a tax, then the producers, because they have an elastic supply, will not bear much of the tax, and the tax will pass to consumers. Similarly, if the consumers have an elastic supply, then the tax will pass, most of the tax will pass to the producers. And in both cases, the government will also suffer because the quantity will be reduced substantially. So, this is a very important point. Your ability to be flexible or to change to different factors, that is, your responsiveness, how much you can respond to a changing circumstance, determines your relative bargaining power in the real world. The more flexible you are, the more will your bargaining power be. Similarly, in a macroeconomic context, economies which have a greater power to adjust or can adjust at a higher speed will be at an advantage vis-a-vis economies which are slow to adjust or which have overall a low level of elasticity of responding either in terms of supply or in terms of demand. So, my dear friends, we come to the end of our module on elasticities. Let's do a little recap on what we've learned. We talked about how elasticities are defined. We talked about the importance of using proportional rather than absolute figures. We talked about the signs that different elasticities could take. We talked about price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity of demand, and cross-price elasticity of demand. We saw what their different determinants were. Most importantly, perhaps, we looked at the 3 rules of elasticity. Let's actually look at a slide which summarizes these three rules rather nicely. Let's go to a slide briefly and then we'll come back and conclude the lecture. Let's go to the slide. As you can see, my friends, Rule 1 simply stated that if the elasticity was less than 1 in absolute value, it would be categorized as inelastic. If elasticity was greater than 1, then that would be categorized as elastic. Two polar positions also emerge, that is that of perfect elasticity, where you have elasticity equal to infinity, and perfect inelasticity, where you have elasticity equal to 0. Bang in the middle, we have unit elasticity of demand, that is, total revenues will neither increase nor decrease in response to an increase or decrease in price. This is because the change in quantity fully compensates for the change in price. Then you can see that Rule 2 relates to income elasticity of demand and simply says that when income elasticity of demand is positive, we are in the realm of a normal good. When it is negative, we are in the realm of inferior goods. Then we saw Rule 3, which relates to cross-price elasticity of demand. And we saw that when this elasticity is positive, we are talking about substitute goods, and when this is negative, we are talking about complementary goods. That, my friends, much to my sadness, concludes our discussion on elasticities. In our next lecture, we will talk about utility theory, and then after that, we'll talk about cost theory. And we'll look at how demand curves are drawn, how supply curves are drawn. So far, we have not looked at the micro foundations of how these demand curves and these supply curves come about. This is exactly what we look at through the use of utility theory and cost theory. So till next time, go and look at the questions I've put up for you on the web. Elasticity is a very interesting topic. Look at those multiple choice questions as well. And then I hope you've developed a reasonable comfort level with this topic. And believe me, it will help you a long way in your understanding of both macroeconomics and econometrics if you're lucky to go that far. So till our next lecture, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.